Brandon Ayuk is back in the conversation again. And if you're a Niners fan, you already know that means one thing. The story is never simple, and it's never quiet for long. This latest check-in on social media is exactly the kind of thing that gets people talking, because it does not feel random. It does not feel like background noise. It feels like one more reminder that Brandon Ayuk is still out there, still attached to the San Francisco 49ers in a very real way, and still giving everybody around this situation a fresh reason to squint at the screen and say, what exactly is going on here? The latest post is the kind of thing that makes you stop scrolling for a second. Not because it is shocking in a traditional football sense, but because it keeps feeding the same weird little fire that has been burning around this whole situation. He is counting money. He is posting from a driveway. He is at Icebox again, or at least tied to Icebox again, which instantly pulls the entire conversation back to those earlier Atlanta posts and the jewelry store backdrop that has already become part of the Brandon Ayuk story. And that matters, because when a player's football future is already murky, every little image starts carrying a lot more weight than it normally would. This is Niners News Today territory, where the details matter because the details are all anybody has to work with. And let's be honest, Niners News has been living in this gray area for a while now. There is no clean, straightforward update here where you can say, all right, he's working out, he's rehabbing, he's about to come back, and everybody can breathe again. It is not that simple. In fact, the problem is that we are not seeing the kind of content that usually tells you a player is grinding toward a return. We are not seeing workout clips. We are not seeing rehab videos. We are not seeing the normal football stuff that would make people say, okay, this guy is locked in and coming back to business. What we are seeing instead is money, jewelry, social media flash, and a whole lot of speculation trying to fill the gap where football evidence ought to be. That is why this latest post lands the way it does. It does not just say, here is Brandon Ayuk living life. It says something louder than that, even if it never says it directly. It says this story is still unresolved, and if you're San Francisco, that has to be exhausting. Because every new post creates the same reaction cycle. Fans look at it. Media circles it. Everybody asks the same question. Is he working? Is he healthy? Is he serious about football? Is this just personal life content? Or is it a clue? That is the ugly little circus that comes with a situation like this, and it is exactly why San Francisco 49ers news keeps circling back to Ayuk over and over again. Now, the part that gets really interesting is that this is not happening in a vacuum. The 49ers still have him on the roster, and they have every reason to keep the situation contained rather than let it explode into something messier. That is the kind of move front offices make when they would rather hold the line than invite chaos into the building. And right now, that is what this feels like from the outside. The 49ers are not racing to clear the deck. They are not acting like a team desperate to cut ties at any cost. They are letting the situation sit, because in the NFL, sometimes the quietest move is the one that keeps the most control in your hands. But that is also what makes these social media posts so annoying for the fan base. They keep the story alive without giving you anything useful. If he were posting workouts, you could at least work with that. If he were showing rehab, you could say there is a plan. If he were saying something direct about football, you could build a real conversation around it. Instead, you get the visual version of a shrug. You get flashes of money and luxury, and a setup that looks designed to make people notice. And of course they notice. Everybody notices. That is the whole point. But for the 49ers, and for the Niners fan trying to make sense of this, It leaves you with more questions than answers. And maybe that is the biggest problem here. Not the post itself, but what it represents. Brandon Ayuk is still talented, still connected to the roster, still somebody the 49ers have to think about, but the football trail is basically gone cold. That is why every new check-in gets treated like a mini-event. It is not just a post. It is a signal flare. It is one more piece of evidence that this story is not settling down anytime soon. And when you combine that with the money side, the roster side, and the fact that the team still has to make practical decisions about what to do next, you can see why this has turned into one of those topics that refuses to die. So the big question coming out of this first part is simple. Are we watching a player who is just living his life, or are we watching a situation that keeps telling you, in its own messy way, that the football side is nowhere near resolved? That is where the tension lives. That is why this matters. And that is why, for San Francisco 49ers news, Brandon Ayuk is still one of the most uncomfortable stories on the board right now. The part that makes this whole Brandon Ayuk saga even stranger is that the 49ers actually have every reason to stay patient right now. That's the twist a lot of people outside the building are missing. Fans see the social media posts, they see the uncertainty, and the natural reaction is, why haven't the Niners just moved on already? But once you peel back the surface and look at the mechanics of this thing, you start realizing San Francisco is playing a very calculated game here. And honestly, from a business standpoint, it makes sense. The 49ers are not operating emotionally right now. They're operating like a front office that understands leverage. And as frustrating as this situation feels for the fan base, the leverage still belongs to San Francisco. That's the key piece of Niners news today that changes the whole conversation. Brandon Ayuk is still under contract, but the really important detail is this. The 49ers are not currently being forced to pay him the massive amount of money everybody keeps talking about. That changes everything, because if the team were bleeding cash right now while getting no football in return, this would already be over. There would be panic. There would be urgency. There would probably be some kind of desperate attempt to force a resolution before training camp even heated up. But that's not the reality. The reality is that San Francisco can sit back, monitor the situation, and wait for Brandon Ayuk to make the next move. That's why the organization has not looked rushed at all. And when you look at the roster decisions, you can actually see it happening in real time. The 49ers recently needed room for another player. A lot of people thought, okay, maybe this is finally the moment they cut Ayuk loose. But they didn't. Instead, they released another player and kept Brandon Ayuk on the 90-man roster. That tells you something. It tells you the front office still believes there is value in controlling this situation, even if the football future itself feels foggy as a Bay Area morning rolling over the Golden Gate. And here's where the money side gets really important, because this is the part casual fans usually don't hear explained properly. A lot of the contract money tied to Ayuk is structured around participation and activation triggers. In plain English, he actually has to show up and engage in the process for certain financial pieces to kick in. That means the 49ers are not trapped in the nightmare scenario people keep imagining, where they are helplessly writing giant checks while getting nothing in return. The structure of the deal gives San Francisco flexibility, and right now they are using every inch of it. That's why you haven't seen the panic button hit inside the organization. And think about it from their perspective for a second. If you release him immediately, what happens? Another team swoops in with zero risk. Washington has been mentioned constantly because of the Jaden Daniels connection dating back to Arizona State. Other receiver-needy teams would line up too. Suddenly, a player you still technically control gets a fresh start elsewhere, while your organization eats the consequences. Why would San Francisco rush into that unless they absolutely had to? That's the chess match here. The Niners are essentially saying, if you want this situation to change, Brandon, you make the move first. Until then, they can afford to wait. And the really fascinating part is that the waiting game itself creates pressure. Every week that goes by without clarity only raises more questions about what Ayuk actually wants. Does he want back in? Does he want out? Does he even want to keep playing football at the level required to justify a massive NFL contract? Those questions are hanging in the air right now, like smoke after a fourth-quarter goal line stand. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the lack of football evidence is impossible to ignore. Again, nobody is asking for a cinematic Rocky montage. Nobody needs him sprinting uphill carrying logs. But in modern NFL culture, players usually show you something, especially players coming off injury situations or contract drama. You see training clips, route running sessions, rehab footage, sprint work, something. Instead, what everybody keeps seeing from Brandon Ayuk is lifestyle content. Jewelry, jets, cash, driveways, Atlanta trips. That disconnect is what's fueling so much speculation around the league and around San Francisco 49ers news. Now look, speculation can get dangerous fast, and it's important not to pretend anybody outside that circle knows the full truth. We don't. But fans aren't blind either. When the football side disappears publicly for this long, people naturally start wondering whether football is still the priority. And that matters inside a locker room. Because NFL players can tolerate almost anything if they believe a guy is fully committed to the grind. Winning covers a lot of scars in this league. Commitment covers a lot too. But once teammates start feeling uncertainty about whether somebody truly wants to be there, that changes the emotional math inside a building. Football locker rooms are not college campuses. They're not social clubs. They are pressure cookers filled with men trying to survive professionally while chasing a championship. Every ounce of trust matters. That's why the 49ers have to be careful here. And the craziest part is that the front office may actually be benefiting financially from the awkwardness of this situation. Because as long as certain triggers don't activate, the salary cap hit stays manageable. San Francisco can essentially keep future cap consequences pushed down the road rather than detonating everything immediately. That's a hidden layer casual fans often miss when they scream for instant moves. NFL contracts are not grocery store receipts. You cannot just rip them up and walk away clean. There are ripple effects everywhere. And honestly, this is where the 49ers deserve a little credit. Even if fans are tired of the drama, they have stayed disciplined. They have not publicly torched Brandon Ayuk. They have not escalated the situation emotionally. They have not started leaking reckless attacks into the media. They have mostly sat there quietly while the internet spins itself dizzy, trying to decode Instagram photos like they're ancient scrolls hidden under Levi's Stadium. That restraint matters, because eventually, one of two things probably happens. Either Brandon Ayuk re-engages with football seriously enough to force a decision, or the 49ers simply continue controlling the timeline until another pathway opens naturally. But right now, San Francisco has no reason to act desperate. And in the NFL, desperation is usually the scent that gets you robbed blind. So while the social media side keeps generating headlines, the real story underneath all of this is much colder and more strategic. The 49ers are not frozen. They are waiting. They are preserving leverage. They are protecting flexibility. And whether fans like it or not, that approach may actually be the smartest thing they can do until Brandon Ayuk himself finally makes the next meaningful move. At some point, though, this whole situation stops being about contracts, Instagram posts, or even roster mechanics. It becomes about identity, about direction, about whether Brandon Ayuk and the San Francisco 49ers still make sense together at all. And that's the real question hanging over this franchise right now. Because talent was never the issue. Nobody doubts Brandon Ayuk's ability when he is fully engaged, locked in, and playing at his best. Niners fans have seen it. The route running, the explosiveness, the ability to create separation when Brock Purdy needs somebody to win fast. At his peak, Ayuk gave this offense a layer that very few receivers in football can provide consistently. That part is real. That part was earned. But in the NFL, availability and alignment matter just as much as talent. Sometimes more. And right now, the alignment feels completely broken. That's why every possible ending to this story feels complicated. If Ayuk suddenly shows up tomorrow, fully engaged, fully healthy, and ready to participate, the 49ers would immediately face a massive decision. Because now, the financial triggers become real. Now, the organization has to decide whether it wants to recommit to a player surrounded by this much uncertainty. That's not a small call. That's a franchise-level conversation. And if you're being honest, it's hard to imagine the team simply pretending none of this happened. Football people remember patterns. They remember reliability. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch have built this roster around trust and accountability. You can survive talent gaps in the NFL if your culture is strong enough. What destroys teams is when the locker room starts feeling like standards apply differently depending on who you are. That's when resentment creeps in. That's when fractures start forming beneath the surface. So even if Brandon Ayuk wanted back in completely, this would not just be a football conversation anymore. It would be a culture conversation. And that's why some fans are already emotionally detached from the situation. You can feel it across Niners news discussions right now. There are people who have basically moved on mentally already. Not because they hate the player, but because the emotional investment has worn thin. Every update feels temporary. Every post feels cryptic. Every possibility feels unstable. Fans are exhausted trying to read tea leaves every other week. But here's the thing that keeps this story alive. There is still no clean resolution on the board. A trade sounds simple until you realize another team would probably want contract adjustments. A release sounds simple until you factor in leverage, salary cap timing, and the risk of helping another contender. A return sounds simple until you think about the human side inside the locker room. Every road has complications attached to it. That's why the 49ers are still sitting in this strange holding pattern. And honestly, the weirdest possibility might be the one nobody saw coming months ago. That Brandon Ayuk eventually has to rebuild his value almost from scratch. Think about how fast the NFL changes. 1 minute you are viewed as a cornerstone player. The next minute, teams are questioning your availability, your priorities, your commitment level, and your market value all at once. The league moves fast. Ruthlessly fast. There's no sentimental pause button. That's why this next stretch matters so much for him personally. Because perception becomes reality in professional sports quicker than people realize. If teams around the league start believing football is no longer the center of the picture, that changes negotiations. It changes guarantees. It changes opportunities. Front offices spend millions trying to avoid uncertainty. Coaches lose sleep over uncertainty. Owners hate uncertainty. The NFL is built on risk management disguised as competition. And that's why the silence from Brandon Ayuk himself has become such a huge part of the story. Not rumors, not reports, not theories. His actual silence. Outside of social media flashes, nobody really knows where his head is. Nobody knows what the long-term goal actually is. And that vacuum creates chaos because people naturally start filling the blanks themselves. That's human nature, especially in the modern NFL media world where every breadcrumb instantly turns into debate fuel by lunchtime. Meanwhile, the 49ers are trying to move forward. That part gets overlooked sometimes. This team still believes it can compete. Brock Purdy is stepping further into leadership territory. The roster still has stars all over it. The expectations inside that building have not changed. Nobody inside Santa Clara is sitting around waiting for a soap opera ending. They are trying to build a contender right now. That urgency never stops in the NFL. The machine keeps moving whether individual situations get resolved cleanly or not. And that's why this story ultimately comes down to one thing: clarity. At some point, everybody involved needs clarity. The team needs it. The locker room needs it. The fan base definitely needs it. And honestly, Brandon Ayuk probably needs it too. Because right now, this entire situation feels like a movie stuck buffering right before the final act. Everybody's staring at the screen waiting for movement. But the frame never changes. So here's the question for you, Niners fan. What do you actually believe happens next? Not what you hope happens. Not the fantasy version. The real version. Do you think Brandon Ayuk ever plays meaningful football for the 49ers again? Do you think this eventually ends with a trade? Or do you think we are heading toward one of the strangest standoffs this franchise has had in years? Drop your prediction in the comments, because this thing is far from over. And if you've been enjoying the coverage, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with another Niners fan who's been trying to make sense of this whole saga. We're pushing toward 2,000 subscribers, and every single one of you helping grow this community makes a huge difference. Turn on notifications too, because with the way this story keeps changing, you already know more San Francisco 49ers news could drop at any moment. Now let me ask you this before you go. If Brandon Ayuk walked back into the building tomorrow ready to play, would you welcome him back? Or do you think the 49ers are already better off moving forward without him?